Hello, everyone. As as we are having students, join us, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Srijna. I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science, and I'm going to moderate the session today. So I want to welcome you all to the Rockefeller College Lunch and Learn series. These events will be taking place throughout the semester. The intention of Lunch and Learn series is to highlight the expertise of our faculty and learn about their research. In these discussions, we hear how the faculty's research impacts society and talks to the most important issues in the country and world in politics and public policy today. These events also aim to educate the audience and our community on relevant issues and topics. And as you guys are joining in for our session today, we are pleased to have Professor Brian Greenhill as the speaker. Dr. Greenhill is professor and the chair of political science in Rockefeller College at the University at Albany. Professor Greenhill's research interests include international relations, human rights, and international organization. His research and teaching focuses on the ways in which economic and political globalization affects human rights, conflict, and environmental outcomes. Professor Greenhill has written extensively on international alliances, including the United Nations. So for the topic for today, which is United Nations 101, what is the UN, what does it do, and can it be a force for good in the world? The UN celebrates its 80th anniversary this year. After the horrors of World War II, many people hoped that the UN would help to create a more peaceful, prosperous, and humane world. So in this Lunch and Learn, Professor Greenhill is going to discuss how scholars of international relations think about the role of the UN in our contemporary international system, especially at a time when the institutions of global governance are coming under immense pressure. As some of you may know, the UN General Assembly is currently ongoing at the UN headquarters in New York City. The world leaders have made speeches at the 80th session of the UN starting last week. So today's talk on the role of the UN is therefore all the more timely, given that the UN General Assembly is closing its general debate today for the year 2025. We have had global leaders discuss the session theme, which is Better Together, 80 Years and More for Peace, Development, and Human Rights. So before I turn it over to our speaker for today, I'm just going to go over ground rules. You're all requested to remain muted and hold your questions until the presentation is over. We will have time for Q&A towards the end of Professor Greenhill's presentation. You can use the raise your hand function or send your question in the chat and I will read it out. If you would like to remain anonymous, you can send your question as a private message directly to me here, and I will read the question aloud. And with that, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Greenhill.
Great. Well, thanks so much for that introduction, Shrishna. And I'm delighted to be able to join you and talk a little bit about the UN for today. So, obviously the UN has been in the news a lot, especially this past week with the sort of high-level General Assembly meeting with the many different heads of state giving quite notable addresses to that. But what I want to do today is just to kind of step back a little bit and talk a little bit about what the UN is trying to do. I'm going to discuss what we can think of as the kind of constitution of the UN, what we call the UN Charter. And I'll talk a little bit about two of the kind of most prominent bodies within the UN. That's the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And then what I think is the really interesting bit is getting to the question of kind of what does this all mean? Is the UN actually making a difference in the world? If so, how do we know that? And, what are some of the challenges that it's currently facing? Okay, so Before I start, I want to just do a little bit of kind of setting the stage, especially for, people in the audience who may not have really kind of thought much about or how we think about the kind of system of international politics in the whole. And so right now I'm actually teaching our introduction to comparative and international politics class, which is a 100 level class for our undergraduates, which is aimed at people who've never studied international relations before. And what I always like to do when I start teaching that class is I ask how many of the students in the classroom have read Lord of the Flies, and usually about at least half of the class put their hands up. And I say to them, that is really kind of how we should approach how we think about international relations. In the novel The Lord of the Flies, this group of schoolboys end up being stranded on an island in the middle of the ocean somewhere, and there are no grown-ups around, and they're having to kind of figure out for themselves how they're going to govern themselves essentially. And throughout the book, there's kind of interesting twists and turns in terms of kind of different forms of kind of order that emerge. When it comes to thinking about international politics, we can very much think of the countries of the world as existing in this kind of Lord of the Flies situation, whereby, unlike with domestic politics, where for the most part we're used to there being this kind of hierarchical system of governance with, in the case of the US, the federal government on top, and then state level government, and then maybe municipal governments at a level below that. In the international system, it's more like this kind of Lord of the Flies situation, or what some people describe as kind of a law of the jungle, or this kind of dog eat dog world. But what's interesting, at least when we come to thinking about the United Nations, is the time in which the United Nations was formed, which was right in the kind of closing days of World War II, when this large conference was held in San Francisco to basically kind of like lay the foundations for what would become the United Nations. And at that point, Harry Truman had just become president. And I wanted to quote some of what he said in his address to the kind of opening session of what was essentially kind of like the first General Assembly of the UN, when people were coming together and trying to kind of decide what they want the post-World War II institutional order to look like. And what Truman says here is interesting. He says the essence of our problem here is to provide sensible machinery for the settlement of disputes among nations. Without this, peace cannot exist. We can no longer permit any nation or group of nations to attempt to settle their arguments with bombs and bayonets. If we continue to abide by such decisions, we will be forced to accept the fundamental concept of our enemies, namely that might makes right. To deny this premise, and we must most certainly do deny it, we are obliged to provide the necessary means to refute it. Words are not enough. We must, once and for all, reverse the order and prove by our acts conclusively that right has might. Okay. So the general spirit here, obviously, is we've, the world has just experienced the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust. And now they're starting to kind of think, okay, that there has to be a better way of organizing ourselves. Let's see if we can come up with a kind of rules-based system that will hopefully act as a kind of brake on the use of force, or the kinds of escalations that could lead to, God forbid, another kind of world war situation. Okay, I want to fast forward 80 years, right? We're now at the point 80 years later in 2025. The UN Charter has been developed. Currently, Donald Trump is president of the United States. He gave a very kind of noteworthy address to the UN General Assembly last week that, involved a lot of kind of very provocative statements. But there's one thing I want to kind of focus on here, which is about how he nowadays, 80 years later, perceives the United Nations. And again, thinking of Donald Trump as a president who is very much kind of against the idea of, what he derides as kind of like globalist approaches to American foreign policy. And so he made news last week by making this remark about the escalator problem and so on. But then what's interesting is he goes on to say the UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it, that such tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. Okay. So what Trump is kind of encapsulating here is, I think, a kind of idea or kind of feelings towards the UN that, despite Trump's kind of unique characteristics as president, nonetheless kind of reflect what I think a lot of American and other world leaders have been thinking about the UN, whereby it's something that does indeed have a lot of great potential, but where there seems to be a lot of kind of very rightful concern about whether it's anything more than just a kind of talking shop. Is it just a place where people get together and kind of issue statements, as opposed to being able to actually make a kind of meaningful difference to how politics are conducted internationally? Okay, so what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about the UN Charter. And so when I'm teaching this to my students, I like to tell them, think of the UN Charter as being like the Constitution of the United States, of the international system. It's kind of setting out some kind of basic principles which are meant to kind of govern the ways in which countries of the world interact with each other. And I think a place that's kind of worth starting is at the very beginning, where in the first chapter of the Charter, it sets out the purposes and principles of the United Nations. And it says that in the first item, the purpose is to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures as necessary in order to maintain international peace and security. It then goes on to say, under this same article about the purposes and principles, that another one is to develop friendly relations among nations. And this bit's important, based on the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. Okay, so what it's saying here is we're going to base this new international order on the idea that kind of all countries are equal in a certain extent. Their countries are going to be, like the way that in most kind of liberal societies, we think of individuals as all being kind of fundamentally equal in most important ways. So the UN Charter is saying the same thing here with regard to the countries of the world. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the kind of inherent tensions in that idea of what it means to think of countries as being kind of equal in that regard. And then it goes on to say that another of the important purposes and principles of the UN is to achieve international cooperation in economic, social, and cultural issues, and so on. Okay. The UN Charter is fairly long, but there are a few specific articles that I want to kind of draw your attention to here. One of perhaps the most important ones in terms of like regulating the use of force is concerned is Article 2.4. And Article 2.4 says all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So in a nutshell, what Article 2.4 is saying, that from now on, international war is going to be illegal, right? The countries that are forming part of the UN, or that are collectively forming the UN, are saying, we're kind of making a pact with each other to say that it's no longer going to be okay, it's no longer going to be kind of our sovereign prerogative to go to war against another country. Okay, so this is really important. What it also says, which is really interesting later in that same article, Article 2.7 goes on to say, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. Okay, so in other words, it's saying that we, the members of the United Nations, we're agreeing that we're not going to go to war with each other. But at the same time, we're agreeing that we're going to kind of keep our nose out of each other's business, right? Things that are essentially within the quote unquote domestic jurisdiction of the state is kind of outside the purview of the UN. Okay. So far, what we've said is that the UN Charter basically kind of outlaws the use of war in the international system, right? But it is more than just a kind of blanket outlawing of the use of war. It does allow force to be used, but only under certain circumstances. And the way in which it allows force to be used is under what's referred to as Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which basically says that when there is a threat to international peace and security, rather than allowing individual member states to decide for themselves how and if to act, instead, what the UN Charter is doing is it's trying to kind of collectivize the response. It's trying to say, let's make sure that all the countries of the world are kind of collectively responding to this. And so under Chapter 7, there are two especially important articles. Article 41 basically says that this body that I'll talk about in a moment, called the Security Council, says that if there were threats to international peace and security, then the UN Security Council can consider taking certain measures, such as the partial interruption of economic relations, i.e., economic sanctions, and the severance of diplomatic relations, as a way to try to kind of compel some other member of the United Nations into acting in a certain way. What's more important and relevant is the next one, Article 42, which says that should the Security Council consider that measures provided for in Article 41 would be inadequate or have proved to be inadequate, in other words, if they've tried some non-violent solution to an international conflict using economic sanctions or something like that, then the UN may take such action by air, sea, or land forces as may be necessary to maintain or restore international peace and security. Right. What's noticed, what's kind of worth noting here is when it says should the Security Council, right? Then it says it may take such action. So it's envisioning a world in which any force that is taken takes place with the prior authorization of the UN through the Security Council, and that it's kind of the UN acting collectively to deal with that threat to international peace and security. It's not, individual countries sort of going off on their own to deal with threats that may arise. It's kind of the UN acting as a whole. Okay. When I teach this to my students, I tell them, look, the UN Charter basically says that it makes war illegal unless it's under a Chapter 7 authorization, whereby the UN as a whole is being authorized to use force. There is, however, another important exception, which is Article 51 of the UN Charter, which says that nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the United Nations. So in other words, it's carving out an exception here for states to be able to engage in self-defense if they are subject to some attack, right? What's interesting, though, is it says that if a member state is coming under attack and exercises its Article 51 right to self-defense, it still then has to refer the situation as soon as possible to the Security Council. And then basically, after it has kind of responded in the short term, it then needs to allow the Security Council to kind of take over after that, after the initial kind of like crisis response. Okay, so just to kind of like sum up what we've learned about the UN Charter. So basically, as I said before, the UN Charter makes kind of old-fashioned wars of conquest illegal, right? It's no longer just the kind of sovereign right of countries of the world to decide when and if to go to war with other states. But there are two important exceptions. One is self-defense, Article 51 that we just saw, and the other one is if the UN Security Council authorizes the use of force in a collective manner because other responses in the form of sanctions or non-violent measures have been unsuccessful, then the Security Council can authorize the use of force under Article 40, under Article 42. Okay. We also saw that the UN Charter very much reinforces the idea of state sovereignty, right? It's not a world government. It's still very much saying to the member states that all you states are kind of independent entities that get to decide what happens within your own jurisdiction in ways that, make sense to you. But then we saw in the principles and purposes of the UN, we saw that a very kind of large part of what the UN is trying to do is trying to kind of reshape the world order in a way that very much kind of promotes economic cooperation with states and very much promotes the idea of universal human rights. And so what's kind of interesting to think about here is that, these two things, certainly number 2 and 3, the idea of this kind of live and let live approach to the international system is very much in conflict with the idea of trying to kind of promote human rights, right? And at the same time, trying to kind of use the structures of the UN to regulate the use of force is an incredibly difficult thing to try to do. And we'll talk about to what extent the UN may or may not have been successful in doing that over the past 80 years. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about two of the main institutions within the UN. The one that probably gets most attention is the UN Security Council, which is the kind of inner committee made up of 15 members that's responsible for dealing with threats to international peace and security. And so it's the UN Security Council that gets to decide whether these Chapter 7 actions, like the use of sanctions or even the use of force by the UN, gets activated. So the UN Security Council is made up of 15 members. It is distinctly undemocratic in the sense that of these 15 member states, 5 of them are what we call the veto-wielding permanent members. And these are the US, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, okay, which were, at the time of the founding of the UN in the aftermath of World War II, kind of the most significant players at that time, right? The other 10 members rotate on and off, and they're voted on by various regional blocs. Okay. What is so important here is that each member of the Permanent Five has the power to veto UN Security Council resolutions. So one way to think about that is that the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK essentially have a kind of get out of jail free card when it comes to any authorization of the use of force by the UN. So in order for force to be used under Article 42, as I talked about before, you need the Security Council to pass a resolution saying we authorize the UN to, try to, compel some other international actor to stop doing something using, forceful measures. Obviously, if ever that was directed at any of the Permanent Five members, or for that matter, against any of their close allies, then any one of the permanent five can just exercise their veto and just say, nope, we're not going to allow that resolution to pass. So, as you can imagine, having the veto power was obviously a very attractive prospect for the permanent five members because it means that the machinery of the UN can never really be used in a way that kind of checks their own use of force. But obviously, it gives rise to kind of very real questions of fairness. So why is it that, these particular states, the most powerful, or at least at that time, the most powerful states in the world, essentially get to kind of play by a different set of rules than all the rest. And we saw earlier that one of the kind of principles of the UN is the idea of kind of sovereign equality. But yet the way in which the UN Security Council is being formed right in the UN Charter kind of locks in this very unequal sense of what it means to be a state nowadays. Okay, the other body that I wanted to talk about is the one that was in the news a lot in this past week, which is the UN General Assembly. So the UN General Assembly is a much broader, kind of more democratic institution within the UN. And so all member states, all 193 of them at the moment, get to participate in debates at the UN General Assembly. And resolutions in the UN General Assembly pass just by a simple majority. So the General Assembly is very much kind of one state, one vote kind of principle. There's no vetoes. So in this case, the permanent five members can, and very often do, find themselves on the losing side of debates within the General Assembly, and resolutions get passed, over the protests of the US or Russia or China or whatever. However, resolutions passed by the UN General Assembly are not really thought of as legally binding in the same kinds of ways that we would think of a UN Security Council resolution as being legally binding. So generally, the UN General Assembly, to be honest, apart from last week, and that usually, this equivalent week in the September of every year, most of the time there's very little attention paid to what goes on in the General Assembly. There's much more attention paid to what goes on in the Security Council because the stakes are so much higher. So the General Assembly, unlike the Security Council, is much more democratic, but also much less consequential. Okay. I also want to emphasize that the UN system, especially nowadays, is about so much more than just the Security Council and the General Assembly. I mean, one kind of narrow way to look at the UN is to look at it just as a kind of set of machinery for trying to regulate the use of force in the international system. But it's also about so much more, right? Which tends not to get quite as much as attention. And so there is an enormous list of other bodies, some of which are kind of organs within the UN, others are kind of associated international organizations that still kind of in different ways do the work of the UN. So for example, one of the kind of important organs of the UN is the International Court of Justice, which is a kind of judicial body for interstate disputes. There's also the UN Human Rights Council, which develops kind of human rights treaties and standards with regard to kind of human rights more generally. It also passes judgment on individual states in terms of how well they are doing with regard to these human rights standards. There are various other more kind of specialized agencies or organizations within the UN system, like the UNHCR, that does a lot of kind of practical work as well as advocacy on the part of refugees. There's UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, which is very active in dealing with climate change and other problems. Related to that, there's like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that kind of synthesizes kind of current thinking about about how we should be dealing with the climate crisis and so on. Okay. So let me just try to kind of wrap up my comments fairly quickly by just kind of summarizing what we've been covering in terms of what the UN actually does, right? So I would say that the UN really tries to do two main things. It tries to regulate the use of force in the international system, as we saw, by trying to kind of make war illegal and only make war be used under certain kind of narrow circumstances. But then it also has this large, more kind of normative agenda of trying to kind of promote human development more generally through the development of human rights standards, economic development, protection of the environment, and so on. Okay. As we saw, the UN Charter is based on the idea of sovereign equality, meaning that all states should be kind of treated as equals. But written right into the Charter is the very idea that there's a certain kind of elite group of states, the Permanent Five, who have this special veto wielding power in the Security Council, which obviously means that power politics, despite what the UN Charter says about sovereign equality, is still going to play a really important role. Okay. The UN, at least at the global level, is certainly the closest thing we have right now to a world government. But the UN has no independent enforcement powers, right? And we've seen, certainly in very recent history, situations where powerful states can bypass the UN wherever they want. So, for example, the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a good example of that. The current crisis or war going on right now between Russia and Ukraine is another good example where there's not going to be any action taken by the UN Security Council because Russia is a veto wielding power and will just make sure that the UN Security Council is unable to do anything that would be critical of Russia in that regard. Same with regard to the war in Gaza. The US has been effective in exercising its veto to prevent any kind of meaningful criticism of Israel's actions in Gaza just now. Okay, so the question I want to kind of leave you with is, is the UN effective or not? And I like to say, I like to say to my students, think of it as like, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty, right? It's certainly not a kind of easy question to answer, but I'll give you some kind of points to think about on either side of that debate. If we start with the more kind of pessimistic response, right? The case for the glass being half empty, if it is like as Donald Trump said in his speech, it's just really kind of empty talk and nothing more than that, then what you could certainly point to is the fact that everything the UN does depends on the consent of the more powerful states, right? So the things that happen in the General Assembly are relatively less kind of politically salient. The things that happen at the Security Council, which are far more politically salient, can be vetoed whenever one of the more powerful member states decides to exercise their veto. And, as I just mentioned, it means that then the UN Security Council, this body that is meant to have kind of fundamentally transformed relationships of kind of war and peace in the international system, becomes like completely impotent when it comes to dealing with current crises like the wars in Gaza or Ukraine. What we also find is that even in this world we live in, where the UN has been in existence for 80 years, nation states are still the kind of key actors in international politics. Whether you live in the US or almost any other country in the world, people's kind of main sense of kind of political allegiance is to their state. It's not to the UN. And so early on, the founders of the UN kind of imagined this idea of kind of a pooling of military resources, whereby the member states are kind of contributing their military powers to some kind of larger kind of UN standing army. that never happened. That never turned out to be kind of politically feasible. Very early on, the kind of Cold War politics got in the way, and any hope of kind of collectivizing force in that way became dashed. Nowadays, and especially now under the Trump administration, the UN is really starved of resources. So a lot of this other work it's done, even outside of the framework of kind of maintaining international peace and security, but a lot of the kind of international development and international health work and so on, that is really kind of at a crisis point now because of the lack of donations from the US, which has historically been one of the largest donors to the UN. Okay, let's flip and look on the other side. What's the case for saying that the glass is half full? Okay, well, what you could point to is the fact that even now, even 80 years later, even in the world where, the president of the most powerful country in the world is one who very much kind of is walking away from this kind of liberal internationalist world order, nonetheless, he was still eager to attend the UN General Assembly last week. Even in his speech, as I showed, he's still eager to kind of emphasize his affinity for at least the idea of the UN, perhaps. So one could call this a success in the sense that the UN has still managed to kind of like carve a place for itself in the popular imagination as being kind of like the main global forum for interstate diplomacy. And as an extension of that, for the development of rules and norms. Okay. Many political scientists, myself included, are very interested in the way in which international organizations like the UN can play an important role in legitimizing the actions of states. So what's interesting, particularly when we look at the behavior of like successive US presidents towards the United Nations, oftentimes we see examples of US presidents, disparaging the UN in certain ways, but they're still very eager to try to get the blessing of the UN before engaging in international action. So think of like the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Ultimately, the George W. Bush administration, failed to get support from the UN, but it went ahead and did it anyway. On the other hand, if you were to take the kind of glass half full approach, you would say, well, isn't it interesting that an administration like the Bush administration would nonetheless even go to the effort of trying to kind of mobilize support within the UN Security Council before taking the action that it did take that led to the invasion of Iraq? On the more practical level, I'd say the UN also is successful in many small ways, right? Although it's had a mixed record with regard to peacekeeping, it has nonetheless, especially in the post-Cold War era, been, somewhat successful in being able to organize peacekeeping missions and develop and deliver humanitarian assistance in many situations. And it also continues to do a lot of work in many kind of thematic areas like development, health, human rights, climate change, and so on, where it's kind of, as I mentioned before, convening kind of scientists and diplomats discussing these issues, trying to kind of develop new frameworks like the Paris Agreement and so on, that are trying to kind of build out systems of kind of governance for dealing with some of these kind of very thorny global issues. So I'm going to stop my presentation there, but I am happy now to engage in discussion with all of you about any of these ideas that have come up.
Thank you, Professor Greenhill. That was a great presentation. We learned about the UN Charter, UN Security Council, the General Assembly, and its relevance in addressing and responding to contemporary global challenges. So we're going to spend the rest of the time in Q&A. I'm going to request you to please use the raise your hand function and ask any questions. And at the same time, you can also just write your question in the chat. So while we wait, to get questions, from the audience, a few of you submitted your questions in advance. So maybe, I'm gonna start us off and read a question from one of you that was submitted in advance, of this talk. So one of the questions is, what is the UN's peacekeeping role as it relates to large and powerful member states like the US? Is there any point at which the UN would be likely to be involved in responding to human rights violations in the US, so within the US domestically, or could the US either avoid or suppress such involvement due to its powerful status within the UN itself?
Yeah, so the short answer is because of the way in which the Security Council is structured, we cannot imagine a situation when the US, or for that matter, any of the other permanent five members, could ever kind of find themselves on the receiving end of a UN authorized intervention in terms of in a conflict, unless I suppose, although it's very kind of hard to imagine if there was some situation where they maybe invited UN involvement, but even there, it would be very difficult to imagine one of the permanent five members wanting to do that. So in terms of the use of force, the answer is no. I just don't think that's ever going to be a realistic possibility. In terms of criticism, though, of human rights practices, well, what's interesting is that we do see that happen. So there is this body that I mentioned briefly called the UN Human Rights Council, which acts as a kind of like quasi-judicial body in the sense that it kind of evaluates and passes judgment on the human rights practices of all members of the United Nations, whether they're a member of the Human Rights Council or not. So, for example, the US has withdrawn from the UN Human Rights Council, but it, just like every other country in the world, is subject to this process called Universal Periodic Review, whereby every 4 to 5 years, the human rights practices of each country is kind of brought under the microscope and is examined by a randomly selected committee of three other member states, and they pass judgment on areas in which that state is performing well or not performing well in different human rights areas. Then the state itself is given a chance to respond and so on, and then the committee makes various recommendations. So the US, just like Russia, China, and other powerful states, still finds itself on the receiving end of that kind of human rights focused criticism. But really, though, that's all it amounts to. It's just criticism. It's kind of public naming and shaming. I mean, that's basically how most of these international human rights bodies operate. They just try to kind of shine a spotlight on human rights violations, but they're not able to, in a practical sense, do much about it. So one could say, again, going with this kind of glass half full approach, one could say, well, even that is quite remarkable. The fact that powerful states are nonetheless kind of willing to subject themselves to this kind of external scrutiny of their human rights practices maybe tells us something about the kind of development of kind of the international order that's maybe very different from how it would have been 80 years ago. But then again, you can certainly argue that what they're agreeing to doesn't in practice amount to very much.
Thank you. Well, I believe the next question might be interesting to a host of students. But before I ask that, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Novkov. She has her hand raised.
Yeah, I have a really basic question. So everything that you've laid out about the powers and authority that the UN has and the structural limits that it encounters, given all of that, what would you characterize as the UN's greatest success and greatest failure?
I think I would say its greatest success, and maybe this is setting the bar very low, is just the fact that 80 years later it's still here. and it's still kind of like the go-to forum for discussions at the global level. I think the fact that we have kind of like normalized this idea that international problems should be dealt with at a kind of global level in a kind of through a kind of deliberative process, I'd like to think is like a big achievement. Um, I would say its greatest failure, again, just kind of looking kind of really sort of from a sort of high level viewpoint, is the fact that it's not kind of succeeded in sort of normalizing the idea of, what we can think of as kind of supranational governance in the same way that, say, the European Union has, whereby citizens of Europe, although they have a very kind of like often very uncomfortable and conflictual relationship with the idea of supranational governance at the EU level, the UN hasn't even become anything close to that. It's still really just a kind of discussion forum. There's not really a sense of it becoming something more like a kind of federal government, at the global level, in the same way that here in the United States, obviously, well, not obviously, I suppose, but most people are kind of comfortable with the idea of a kind of federal system of dealing with problems that are above the level of individual states.
I'm going to ask the next question from one of the students. How would someone gain an opportunity to work with the UN as a student?
I am probably not the best person to ask about that. The UN does have, it has a very kind of well institutionalized like internship program, which is very competitive. It's very difficult to get into, but obviously there are, thousands of people who participate in this. Um, I would definitely suggest speaking to one of the Rockefeller College career staff for advice on how best to kind of navigate that process. There certainly is a process and a very kind of sophisticated system for training, the kind of next generation of UN staffers.
Great. I think we have time for a couple more questions. This is from one of the students. How does the UN maintain its relevance when it's so frequently undermined by the Security Council members, especially in the era of authoritarianism from the US and democratic backsliding?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's very much a kind of live question because, for those of us who study international organizations, this is a very kind of worrying time, for a long period, and especially around about the time of the end of the Cold War, when the UN seemed to be kind of undergoing this kind of renaissance because the kind of the Cold War rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union that basically kind of made the Security Council pretty inactive for 40 years kind of suddenly came to an end. And then the UN started being much more active again. Now, what we're seeing over the past 10 years or so is the world very much in a kind of democratic recession. We're seeing leaders in the US, like President Trump, who are very explicitly kind of like hostile to many of the kind of liberal internationalist values that the UN embodies. And so I think it really is a kind of open question as to whether or not this kind of post-World War II liberal institutional order will survive. One of the kind of open questions has been in how will other states kind of fill the vacuum that will be left by the US under President Trump, kind of stepping back from its commitments to international organizations. And particularly, how will China respond? Will China not be particularly interested, or will it try to kind of fill that void? For now, at least, it looks like China is wanting to kind of step up, but obviously to do so in its own terms, to kind of prioritize the values and the issues that it cares more about at the expense of other ones that US leaders have traditionally wanted to use the machinery of the UN to try to promote, like democracy and human rights and so on. So I guess right now we're at a real kind of inflection point, and it might turn out that this is just a kind of a blip, and we're going through maybe a decade or so when there's a kind of much less kind of investment in international institutions, and things are just kind of frozen for a while. Or sadly, it might be a situation where a lot of this starts to unravel and where we go from a more kind of rule-based international order to one where many kind of observers talk about as kind of spheres of influence, where maybe we have a kind of like Western kind of world and a more kind of China-dominated part of the world and so on. So it's very hard to say for now, but I think what we can say for sure is that these principles are coming under great stress right now.
I think we have time to just squeeze in one last question. And what I'm going to do is kind of combine two questions into one because they're also kind of related questions. So there is a question that has come in the chat. And, you have touched up in it so far. So if the UN fails to fulfill its intended potential, as some critiques like Trump have argued, what consequences might the world face? And in that case, what possible alternatives could arise to the UN? So what possible alternatives can emerge? And also, how does the UN respond to President Trump's actions and his administration's actions, where the administration has withdrawn from multiple UN agencies? So I think we can close with that.
Yeah, no, I mean these are both great questions. I mean, one way to think about it is if we didn't have the UN, if we didn't even aspire to deal with these problems through sort of global collective action, then we could go back to a world where just groups of states club together and kind of deal with problems that in their own backyard or not in their own backyard if it suits them to intervene in other situations. I mean, one kind of benefit that the UN or anything else that kind of takes that form offers to every state is the idea of predictability, right? So, one way to think about the UN or kind of like any system of laws for that matter, like on the domestic level, is that generally people want to operate in environments where there's kind of predictability around the actions of others. And so rather than living in a completely kind of anarchic system where everyone just does whatever they want to do based on what they feel motivated to do at that point in time, generally we can think of kind of rational actors as kind of wanting to kind of set up a system whereby they agree they form a kind of compact of kind of agreeing to certain principles that's going to govern their behavior. So at a minimum, you can think of the UN as being successful in that regard, and that even if the US, or at least previous US governments have had like a very different sets of values from other countries like maybe Russia or China, right? They nonetheless are kind of united in their desire to have a kind of predictable and rules-based international system. So from that very kind of minimal point of view, you could say that there's kind of like a desire, and there's then likely to be a kind of like supply of some kind of rule-based structure, and that then the UN is kind of unlikely to become kind of completely irrelevant. There'll still be investments made in trying to kind of regulate the use of force. And what's interesting too is even what we think of as kind of bad actors, even think of like Russia's invasion of Ukraine or full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Russia won't argue that it was violating the UN Charter in doing so. it will come up with some kind of creative interpretation of the UN Charter that says that really its invasion of Ukraine was really about kind of humanitarian intervention. It was protecting Russian speakers or something like that. So generally, there's a kind of shared interest in trying to ensure that we, as in the countries of the world, are kind of following some kind of rule-based order. So that gives me a little bit of optimism in terms of, the ability for the UN, in whatever form it may be, or even some potential future successor to the UN, that it will hopefully be able to act as a sort of something of a constraint on the behavior of individual states. The second question about the impact of US disengagement with parts of the UN and with other international organizations. Again, this is kind of really hard to tell right now what's going to happen. We sort of had a practice run of this back in 2017 in the context of climate negotiations, where in 2015, the Paris Agreement on climate change had just been formed. And then when Trump took office in 2017, about 6 months later, he announced that he was withdrawing the US from the Paris Agreement. And at that point, many people who study the politics of climate change were really worried that this would make for the kind of unraveling of the whole kind of intergovernmental effort to regulate climate change. Thankfully, that didn't quite happen in the sense that no other state chose to follow the Trump administration's lead in walking away from the Paris Agreement, although it's certainly an open question whether it nonetheless had a kind of chilling effect in terms of just slowing down the kind of level of enthusiasm for it. So, perhaps that some of these institutions will prove to be kind of resilient enough to kind of withstand a period of time when the US is not particularly invested in them. But again, kind of only time will tell, and it'll depend upon the extent to which some of these issues like climate change are felt to be kind of urgent enough global collective action problems that other states in the world will continue to kind of up their investment. I mean, to some extent, we're seeing that with regard to like Europe's response to the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. Well, we have neared the end of the discussion today. I want to thank Professor Greenhill and you all for attending. Before we close, I want to note the date and topic of the next Lunch and Learn session. It'll be on October 15, so in 2 weeks' time from now, October 15 at the same time. We will have our faculty discuss the upcoming US Supreme Court term. The panel of speakers will preview the key cases and constitutional questions on the docket for the upcoming US Supreme Court term. Again, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I hope to see you all at the next Lunch and Learn session. You will have the details in your email soon. Goodbye and have a nice day ahead.
Thanks, Rishna.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.